Hello everyone, this is County Historian Larry Tippin. We have been talking about the tiny towns and vanished villages of Putnam County. And today we want to talk about Pleasant Garden and Reelsville, two communities separated by Big Walnut Creek, but pretty much considered one and the same. This is a screenshot, a different presentation. But I wanted to show you that if I get ahead of you, if you're still reading newspaper article or studying a map, you can pause at any time, or if you want to go back and look at something, like I maybe went ahead too fast on a slide, you can grab this button and pull it back, and then you can study again. We'll start with some of the maps, show you representation of Pleasant Garden and Reelsville. This is the 1864 map of Putnam County, courtesy of the Library of Congress. It's online, it's available. You can do a search for it. It's pretty nice to have this. You can see the National Road coming from Manhattan, kind of winding quite a bit through Pleasant Garden and continuing west across Big Walnut and then out of town to the west. We're going to zoom in on this area here. We'll see Pleasant Garden, not very big, but you can see where the plot of it had been laid out. Same thing with Reelsville. Not very much here just yet, but it's plotted out. On ahead, we'll talk about the plots. And this is the railroad that came through. We'll look at that as we go. This is 1879. We'll see that the National Road, which now is US 40, came through Manhattan, a little bit straighter now, through Pleasant Garden. Zoom in on this area again. First thing we notice is that the road stops. It no longer goes west out of Pleasant Garden. It goes instead down through Reelsville. We'll talk about why that happened. And this is a current map with a very serious error on it. Pleasant Garden is always singular, never plural. And it shows Pleasant Garden and Reelsville separated by Big Walnut, pretty much one and the same. And there's an interesting little road here that you go off of Highway 40. You have to really be looking for it. Then back on the road, it goes nowhere. That's part of a remnant of the old National Road, when it was still a cement type road with a very scary cement bridge. It's kind of interesting to see. It's kind of a nostalgia. You can see what it was like 100 years ago. This is a close-up 1864. The 1864 map, in addition to having the county, it has some of the communities like Greencastle and some of the others, so forth. Well, this is Pleasant Garden, significant enough in 1864. They had lap of it. Here's McCormick. This is probably where the first inn was in Pleasant Garden. We also see the physician Allen and Macaulay. And then business directory doesn't show much. It shows who owns various property and where the homes were in 1864. And the same thing for Reelsville. We see that Polly Ford keeps the hotel, which is located here. This is the road that came down Pleasant Garden. The Terre Richmond Railroad came through, later became the Vandalia, and then the Pennsylvania. Then a post office. Reelsville had a post office in Reelsville at that time. The first post office Reelsville was 1852, about the time the railroad came through, with William Reel as the postmaster. Then here's the detail of the 1879. We'll look at these one at a time, starting with Pleasant Garden. We'll see McCormick Blacksmith Shop and Dr. Allen's home and office, and then at Whitty in lot 22, and a few other homes, some of the lots. In Reelsville, see the hotel over there. But what's the significant thing about this is Daniel Reel mill. It was actually two mills. It was a grist mill, turbine driven, that a dam type thing across Big Walnut, and then a steam sawmill farther down near the railroad bridge. Well, that was kind of interesting. See the school and the church and so forth. Let's talk about these communities. Reelsville was probably first settled about 1826 by John and Mary Reel, where they built a cabin and a mill. But they did not plat out Reelsville until 1852, about the time the railroad came through, as documented in the plat records at the county recorder's office. They're in a mill for a long time, well over a half century. But then Big Walnut flooded very severely in 1875. Steve Bonney wrote a nice article about that in the county museum's new letter that we call the Arch. You want to read about that. But pretty much everything along Big Walnut 1875 was flooded out. It was a very severe flood. Their son then, Daniel Reel, built another mill, operated it for some time, and then when it was not anymore, no longer economically efficient, he sold it. John King, a neighbor, bought the lumber and the timbers to construct his barn on his farm. Pleasant Garden was platted January 20th, 1830, again according to plat records at the county recorder's office, by John Matkin, or Matkins, singular or plural, either one is acceptable, who came from North Carolina. We'll study that. There was another resident named John Whitty, who was a justice of the peace, an enterprising man. He was said to have been one that had a contract to help construct the original National Road about 1828 in the area of Pleasant Garden. What they did was they solicited, the National Road solicited bids from people that would take a mile at a time and clear the road. And we think that Whitty was one of those. So he would have been there about 1828 when the National Road was first cleared. Talk about that. And then we think he built possibly the first tavern / inn on the northeast corner of the only intersection in Pleasant Garden. Here's a story in the 1966 history of Putnam County we call the sesquicentennial, coincide with the state's sesquicentennial. This book has a lot of interesting information, but also has a lot of folklore unsupported by primary source documentation, including this. It says, where the grocery store was located in 1966, there was once a two-story log inn with a grocery store and guest rooms. Back of the inn was a very beautiful garden, and in front of it ran the old National Road, 80 foot wide, right away for the oxen to graze as they went through the road. It said that Abraham Lincoln spent the night there, and of course he did. Abraham Lincoln slept at every single inn along the National Road and about everywhere else in the country. If he would have slept everywhere he's credited as sleeping, he would have had to live about 6 or 7 lifetimes. But he did, of course. As usual, he arose early, took a stroll in the lovely garden. And at breakfast, he reported to the lady that ran the inn, you have a pleasant garden. And that was the basis for the name. That is absolutely not true. Not at all. First off, if you think about the logistics of it, when Pleasant Garden was platted and given the name Pleasant Garden in January of 1830, Abraham Lincoln was not yet 21 years old. The family was in the process of moving from southern Indiana to Illinois. And also the National Road, which was surveyed 1827 and first opened up with the original dirt path. It was 60 feet wide. In 1828, it was very difficult to travel. And then it was graded in 1833 and 1834 and more or less graveled, macadam type road. So it's not the well-traveled road, we think of it today, in 1830. We'll talk about the National Road, an interesting history of it, a different presentation. Let's talk about John Matkin. Did a lot of research on him. This is from one of those genealogy sites. Not necessarily accurate. You can't really take their word for it, but they do, in fact, include some primary source documentation, which you can verify. Said that he was born in 1803 in Orange County, North Carolina, and died September 24th. It's actually September 2nd, 1833, in Putnam County, Indiana. But they, as a reference, they include the 1830s census for Putnam County, where we do find John Matkin and his young wife and their 2 children, a boy and a girl, both under the age of 5, in Putnam County in 1830. Also did quite a bit more research, found John Matkin in the marriage records of North Carolina, where in 1824 he married Elizabeth Grogan, if I'm pronouncing that properly, in Rockingham County, North Carolina. Rockingham County is right here, and then the next county south of that is Guilford County. Rockingham County actually was once part of Guilford, but it split off in the late 1700s. But in Guilford County, North Carolina, we see the village of Pleasant Garden. This is from the village's website. You can go visit it if you like. Just search for Pleasant Garden, North Carolina, you'll see this. Settled 1757, very old community. And apparently its main claim to fame was that Bishop Asbury, the father of the Methodist movement in America, stayed in Pleasant Garden, North Carolina, a couple of times. And yes, this is the same Bishop Asbury that Indiana Asbury is named after, now at DePaul University, of course. And then what we do is, if we think somebody lived in a location and had to take out a land patent, we look and see if it says where they came from. Land patent is the first deed the United States government issued to the first landowner. You can go to the Bureau of Land Management website if you'd like to view the land patents. It's pretty cool. It has a legal description, and then where they came from. So this is the 3 Matkin brothers who came to Putnam County, beginning with Isaac, who settled Section 10 Madison Township about 1821, we believe, possibly 1822. Took out a land patent. And then John, who took out a land patent in the area that became Pleasant Garden, Washington Township. And then their brother William, who came a few years later. All 3 of these, you'll notice, say of Putnam County, Indiana. It's not uncommon for someone to come and stake a claim, so to speak, and settle, and then go get your land patent. Apply for the land patent. Takes a year or sometimes more for the patent to actually be issued after it's applied for. So we were kind of hoping that one of these would say that where they came from, but they all 3 say of Putnam County. Behind the Reelsville post office, there's a small cemetery with 2 graves. One that's illegible, which is Elizabeth Matkin, and this one, which is John Matkin, born 1803, died September 2nd, that's a D, 1833. So we can see from the preponderance of the evidence that John Matkins either lived in Pleasant Garden, North Carolina, or lived near Pleasant Garden, North Carolina, certainly not far from it, if not in it. And it's almost certain, and I'm going to say it is certain, my opinion, that John Matkins named Pleasant Garden in Putnam County, Indiana, after Pleasant Garden, North Carolina. They talk about the tug of war between Reelsville, Pleasant Garden. It's kind of an interesting story, friendly competition, if you will. First, Pleasant Garden had the supremacy because the National Road went through Pleasant Garden. But then the Indianapolis Terre Haute Railroad was built, constructed, going through Reelsville in 1852. That railroad, of course, was later called the Vandalia, Pennsylvania, no longer in operation. But as we noted, 1875, the Big Walnut flooded to such a point that the bridge over Big Walnut was washed out west of Pleasant Garden. So the National Road then was relocated. As you basically from the east, it came into Pleasant Garden, and then it went down the famous Reelsville Hill and across Big Walnut at that point into Reelsville, and then continued west through Reelsville. And then Reelsville then had the supremacy, if you will. It had the train station, the post office. The National Road went right through it. It was really going. It had 4 stores at one time. It was quite booming. So it gave Reelsville then both the railroad and access to the National Road. But in 1922, a new bridge was built over Big Walnut. So the traffic on the National Road continued west through Pleasant Garden instead of down the center of Reelsville. At about that time, the train station, the depot at Reelsville, was closed. And in 1926, a truck hit the old wooden bridge that went from Pleasant Garden to Reelsville on the Reelsville Hill. And Reelsville then, for a time, was temporarily cut off from the National Road completely. Not only did it no longer go through Reelsville, you had to take a detour or bypass to get to the National Road. This is a photo of that. It's on April 6, 1926. It's struck by a truck driven by an Everett Ridgway of Poland who was hauling a truckload of ties, possibly as he went down the hill. His brakes may have failed. I'm not sure what happened, but he struck the side of the bridge with such a force that knocked it off of its foundation. This photo is courtesy of the Putnam County Library Archives, and it noted that Charles Hoskins and his sister Faye Hoskins McDonald are the two in the photo surveying the damage of the Reelsville Bridge. So then, Reelsville, after that happened in 1926, it pretty much lost most of its businesses. Even the post office and school were moved across Big Walnut to Pleasant Garden, but they retained the name Reelsville. So you go to the post office in Reelsville, you're in Pleasant Garden. And then in 1940, US 40 was made a 4-lane road and moved considerably south of the old National Road, much to the dismay of Dewey Osborne, who operated the truckers' haven in Pleasant Garden, and the community as a whole, stating they were about as far away from the great highway as Reelsville had been. So the two villages now, for all practical purposes, are considered one, with the Reelsville Fire Department, school, and everything else either in Pleasant Garden or south of Pleasant Garden. The Reelsville School was recently purchased, I believe, by an alumnus. Always love to see the photos. It's a really neat photo. Pennsylvania Railroad Depot, according to the Putnam County Public Library, the archives. Kenny Eggers, Wayne McCullough, Burl Hutchison are the 3 men standing there. This is also from Putnam County Public Library archives. It's not dated, but it says it's not the 1913 flood. I'm not sure what the significance is of that, but that's what's written on it. But it kind of shows you what it's like when Big Walnut gets out and floods. I live in northern Putnam County myself. Big Walnut runs across the back of my farm, and it is a very fierce monster at times. There's very cool newspapers. Love to read the newspapers. This is from the Indiana American in 1836. This is when Pleasant Garden was just brand new, only 6 years after it settled. saying that James Heath of Pleasant Garden, while in state of intoxication in the grocery of, I'm not going to pronounce this right, so Beriah Duffield, I'm going to say maybe. That's one thing that interesting about this. It says who had the store in 1836 in Pleasant Garden. Then they had Mr. Duffield, I guess, basically defended himself with a knife that he found laying and stabbed the intoxicated Heath, but he was found not guilty, or not, probably not even charged, saying he was in self-defense. But what's interesting about this, it came from the Greencastle, Indiana Plowboy. Thanks to Hoosier State Chronicles, where we get these newspaper accounts, we can access some of the early newspapers. The Hoosier State Chronicles is a very ambitious project undertaken by the State Historical Society, State Library, to get the newspapers digitized and online, and it's free, it's available. They don't have them all, it's still a process. They're working very, very hard at it, but they do have some of the interesting ones, including the Western Plowboy of Greencastle. It's the August of 1837. And on page 5 of that, by the way, just basically saying this, Elijah Williams has a cow, 10-year-old cow, that's apparently strayed, certified by William Matkin being the justice of the peace, the younger of those three brothers we were talking about that came to Pleasant Garden. It was kind of interesting. Other old newspapers, by the way, were the Hoosier, the Greencastle Visitor, Putnam County Chronicle, Putnam County Sentinel, and the predecessor of the Plowboy, the Greencastle Advertiser. It's very neat. Go to the Hoosier Chronicles and read some of these old newspapers. This interesting advertisement, 1853, where this Woodrum has erected a sawmill 3 miles north of Reelsville Mill. Doesn't call it Reelsville, it calls it Reelsville Mill, which is also what's called in this article from 1856, with this Hugh Todd, has 2 horses that have strayed, an 8-year-old flea-bitten gray mare who apparently doesn't care much about, but he would like to find this 2-year-old filly living at Reelsville Mill. But he says he's going to write to him, you have to write a letter, to the Reelsville post office. The Reelsville post office was called Reelsville. It was never called Reels Mill, but the community was called Reels Mill, not Reelsville in its early days. I thought that was kind of interesting. 1866, where Oliver Johnson accidentally shot in Reelsville on election day. And then this is neat. This is a advertisement from the physician Stevenson of Pleasant Garden, offering his services in 1859. And then a man named George Sublet, if that's how you pronounce it, apparently became intoxicated and ended up laying on the track of the railroad, Terre Haute Richmond Railroad, which came through, apparently went right over his body. The Sublet family, if that's how you pronounce it, had great tragedy. Several of the members of the family died young, including their sister, Mary, who had the misfortune of marrying Greenberry Mullenix. We'll talk about that story a different time. This is a long article. I cut it up into 4 parts just so we could read it. But if you want to go to the Hoosier Chronicles and find it, you can do the whole thing. I'm going to go through these 4 parts. The Putnam Times-Original News, that newspaper itself, has an interesting history, which I talked about when I talked about Roachdale. But they're saying here in 1934, doing a nostalgic look at the National Road as it went through Pleasant Garden, noted that old-time circuses traveled through. Again, you can pause and read these articles at any time, or you can go to Hoosier Chronicles and get the actual article if you'd like. Part 2 of this goes on to say, Pleasant Garden was laid out for settlement in 1834 by John Matkin, which is correct. making it the oldest town in Putnam County except for Manhattan, which is not correct, because Greencastle was platted first as a town, didn't become a city until many years later. Blakesburg and Swanksville and Russell Township and many others. But Pleasant Garden was the second on the National Road. Maybe that's what they meant to say. There's an ancient stagecoach tavern in the northeast corner of the road's intersection, which we've been talking about, pointed that out, which was pink. That had to have been quite interesting. Talk about Big Walnut being sometimes turbulent. And the bridge was a timber affair, which was a toll bridge. And then they talk about the circus come to town, saying this at one time, according to the local folklore, an elephant was playing in the water, and he squirted other animals and men. The water he pulled out of his trunk. And on the way up the hill, he found a wagon that had a bundle of hay, grabbed a bundle of hay, much to the dismay of the teamster running that wagon. And then this talks about the toll gatekeepers. This is interesting. If you're interested in it, you pause and read it if you'd like. Continuing on, though, I have to tell this story. It's a very interesting story, also folklore. Maybe has some truth to it, maybe not, but it's too amusing not to tell. It says, just west of Pleasant Garden, where Oak Hill is now, there is a log cabin north side of the National Road near Big Walnut, which was supposed to have been haunted. Many years ago, this John Griffin and his wife, who lived there, had went to church one evening where some young hooligans decided they would play a prank on them. They captured a cat and somehow affixed walnut shells or half shells of walnut to the cat's paws. I'm not sure how they fixed it, but whatever they did. According to the legend, when the couple came home, the cat was disturbed, running over the attic, making such a great noise as you could only imagine. With these walnut shells, the couple thought the house was haunted and ran out. I thought that was a very interesting story, true or not. And this is an article from 1940 that I mentioned earlier, where Dewey Osborne, the operative of Truckers Haven, was quite upset that the highway is going to be moved considerably south of Pleasant Garden, and his great efforts to try to keep the highway going through Pleasant Garden, which was not going to happen. Very cool photo of the Reels Mill at Reelsville. It was cut off, but we're certain this says erected 1826. Very, very nice. And then we have a drawing in the 1966 history of the Barnett Mill. Now, the Barnett now is incorrectly referenced as being in Reelsville, but it was not in Reelsville. Barnett's Mill was south of Reelsville. This is back to 1864. We see as the National Road went west from Pleasant Garden, and just before it crossed the bridge, it goes south. Basically, this road's on a ridge in between two valleys, so to speak, just east of Big Walnut. And we'll zoom into this area where we see the Barnett Cemetery, which is right on the edge of the road. We see a lot of cemeteries that are in the woods, in the middle of nowhere. I wonder, why did somebody put a cemetery this far off the road? Well, at that time, the road was there, and this was the road in 1864. And you see a grist mill, and a sawmill, and a blacksmith location. There have been descendants of the Barnett family. The first land patent, by the way, was taken in this area, 1836, by David Barnett. But some descendants have been excavating this, and they took me there and showed me one day their efforts, not long ago. And you can see where the forge was for the blacksmith shop. You could literally see the remnants of the cast iron or metal blacksmith forge and a well and foundations of homes on both sides of the road. And you could clearly see where the road was still there, just a dirt path through the woods basically, but you could clearly see it. It's very wonderful that these people They took an effort in the Barnettville, sometimes called Barnett Town or Barnett Mill area, to try to preserve its history. It's been said that some sort of a sickness went through and the ground was bad, quote unquote, making it uninhabitable, and there's nothing there now except those remnants. I hope you've enjoyed a little discussion of Pleasant Garden, Reelsville, and also Barnett Town, Barnettville. Come back, we talk about another one.